Hello and welcome to session 175 in the AISafety.com reading group. Tonight we are honored to have Stuart Russell with us. Stuart Russell is Professor of Computer Science at Berkeley and the founder and leader of the Center for Human Compatible Artificial Intelligence. Stuart, thank you for joining us.
Well, it's nice to be here.
So the first question is one that came up in the reading group with your description of how we might expect language learning systems to become more powerful. And there was an analogy with the fission pile experiment back in the 40s, where there was subcritical systems that suddenly turned critical, and we found an analogy with a language learning system, where just as in fission we have some neutrons that causes fission, and this fission causes neutrons to be emitted, which creates more fission, etc., in some kind of chain reaction. Then learning systems seem to have the same dynamic, in that reading requires understanding and understanding requires reading, and when you have a system that's not good enough to process this, then you end up with something that fizzles out, something where the language learning system seems to end up with having like 0.1% credibility in the claim that the sky is a cube or something totally silly like this. But when the system improves just a tiny bit, then this kind of then we can get this kind of feedback loop where the system becomes less and less wrong. Do you think this is a good analogy?
Um, I mean, at a very, very high level, yeah, you would expect a sufficiently good reading system to improve over time, but not necessarily to explode. I mean, basically it would asymptote in the sense of um, once it was good enough to understand everything the human race had ever written, then there's nothing else to read. But in detail, it's you can't describe the system as having a single parameter R, because there'll always be pieces of text that are relatively easy to read and have a pretty unambiguous semantic interpretation. Um, and so a system that in general uh, is going to make increasing numbers of mistakes would still be able to gain information from these islands of certainty. So it's really much more complicated than a nuclear reaction. Um, does Google, well, so what I'm describing here actually is a system that reads in order to understand and extract the content. Most of what's going on, so when you hear all these stories about GPT-2 taking over the world, it doesn't understand any of the content. GPT-2 is just a description of what strings of words typically look like. And that's all. So, um, so when you look at the systems that are actually designed to acquire content and then use that content to understand and acquire more content, you might look at some of the systems that the Allen Institute is building. And there's reasonable fact extraction, when the facts are expressed in fairly simple ways. But most of what Google does for fact extraction, so the stuff that goes into the knowledge graph, is either manually extracted or done using patterns or done using machine readable text. So actual markup in machine readable form that people put on their web pages, and then is extracted by Google into the graph. So I think we're a long way away. I mean, I know if you go back and read some of the stuff that Doug Lenat wrote about Psych, that was the plan, that they would build a knowledge base by hand, and that would enable it to become good at reading, and then all the rest would happen by reading, and it would kind of, take off by itself. But nothing has that property, and I think we're still quite a long way away from it.
Okay, thank you. The next question is about coherent extrapolated volition, which is one thing that was absent from the book, Human Compatible. Um, Coherent extrapolated volition. I don't know if you are familiar with this.
Yeah,
This.
yeah, it is mentioned in the book, actually. I
Oh,
think that
I must have
there's
missed it.
at least,
Sorry.
there's at least two notes that talk about it. Um, and basically, I think that what he's trying to do with that is similar to what we're talking about in the first principle, that it's about what you would prefer the entire future to be like. But it's not this. I mean, it does, the CEV article doesn't cover the second and third principles, really. I mean, he talks about models, so he points out correctly that we are uncertain about our own preferences. We also don't act exactly in accordance with our own preferences, and we may not have coherent preferences. And he puts all that under the heading of muddle. But I think there's a significant, extra piece having to do with the fact that machine uncertainty about preferences is in fact a feature, not a bug. And then how that gets formulated into a game, and how AI systems are solving that game, or should be solving that game. Those are some of the key points.
Okay. There have been no questions from the audience yet, as far as I can tell. So I'll just continue here with talk about inside view arguments compared to outside view arguments. Now, Rohin Shah, who I believe is also from the Center of Human Compatible AI, he recently posted on the Alignment newsletter a long story, a collection of a number of people arguing that we should primarily be using the outside view arguments to think about how AI will look in the future. And I think this both a good question. How should we weigh how much credence we put to outside view arguments compared to inside view, and is there a principled way to figure out if we should think mostly about comparing the singularity with other things, or trying to open the black box like you're doing?
Well, this is a very sort of high meta kind of discussion. I mean, if I try to apply this outside view to things that have happened before, so let's say what happened with the internet. So I'm old enough to remember the time when there was no internet, and I think there were a few visionaries like Doug Engelbart who had some inkling of what it might be like, but I would say most people didn't pay attention or didn't believe him. I mean, go back to the 1940s and computers. The people who should know, like the CEO of IBM and people like that, said they didn't think, we'd need more than 5 or 6 computers in the whole world. So I would say, people have a very hard time predicting this on the basis of past experience, right? I mean, the reason he was saying that was because that was how much computing the world did. And you could easily do all of the world's computing with 5 or 6 computers. QED, right? And if you thought about the internet, well, you'd think about the internet kind of like we think about the phone system. That was another case, similar case, phone system. Okay, what does the phone system do? Well, everyone talks to each other. In fact, before the phone system existed, people didn't think that anyone would ever talk to each other, right? You've got, what's this? What will we do with these phones? What are they for? and they didn't envisage that we would talk to each other. And then with the internet, people thought, oh, well, that's great. We'll be able to, send messages to each other over this internet. And no one anticipated anything like the World Wide Web. Um, and people living their entire lives online, and all of this stuff. Yeah, I mean, sure, you might find some science fiction writers, but generally, I would say that previous cases tend to be extremely misleading. When you're using a previous case, you have to look at, well, what are the differences and how would those differences play out? So you're forced into visualizing the details of the process, even if you try to make a prediction on the basis of a previous case. So I don't really see this as much of a dichotomy, but just be extremely modest about our abilities to make these concrete predictions on a large scale.
Okay. Chris, as far as I can tell, your statement comment below is not a question, so I will continue to the next question about the AI debate, where it would be really nice, as you say, to restart the AI debate. And so I tried to see if anybody had replied to your book, and I found two cases. David Leslie writing in Nature a review of your book, quite skeptical, and Melanie Mitchell writing an op-ed in the New York Times as replies to yours. And in the reading group, we went through this paragraph by paragraph, and we are sorry to say that these two answers didn't really seem to advance the debate in any substantial way. There were a number of things they were confused about, and a number of outright errors. As far as I know, there were no. You didn't make a reply to this, and the debate kind of just died there. And do you think there was some discussion also from the on less wrong and places like that? But do you think engaging with these kind of critics outside of the rational sphere is a good idea? These kind of reasonably high credential people?
Well, I would have engaged with them had they come up with any plausible. Well, there's really two different things here. So David Leslie, I think, I mean, he apologized to me in person for writing what he did, and I think in some sense he didn't intend. He wanted to sort of be combative, and somehow it just came out wrong. I don't think this is what he really intended. You'll notice that his article doesn't actually say what the book is about, which is a pretty weird review. He complains. So I talk about 4 major open problems in AI. He complains that these problems have been open for a long time. Well, of course, open problems have always been open. They've never been closed and then they become open. So I don't know what I did wrong. So there was a bunch of weird stuff, and it just didn't seem much point in trying to respond to it. And then Melanie Mitchell's article basically says that, out of all the things they could do in the universe, AI systems will necessarily decide that benefit to humans is the only thing that matters. I mean, there's 8 million species on Earth that they could choose to be of benefit to, and they just happen to choose humans, let alone all the other species in the universe on other star systems. That seems like a pretty low probability event that is just going to happen automatically. So I found that argument, it's already dismissed in the book. So why I don't think she read the book very carefully. Otherwise, she would have engaged with the place in the book where it explains why her own argument is completely fallacious. So again, it didn't seem that this was the beginning of a worthwhile debate. Maybe in the Melanie Mitchell case, because there are some other people who have this view. Sometimes Rod Brooks seems to suggest that it's just in the nature of intelligence that you're going to be helpful to humans. And Steven Pinker as well just sort of assumes that automatically, as technology gets better, it's going to happen. So maybe it's worth engaging with that, but yeah, a bit disappointing so far. And well, I mean, maybe no one has uh, a serious and sustainable disagreement with the book. Looking on the bright side.
Yeah. So the next question is actually no. This question, well, one of the things that you talk about and defend in the book is consequentialist preference utilitarianism. And I think, in my experience from the reading group and knowing the people here, there is probably a lot of people here who agree with this and at least lean towards consequentialist preference utilitarianism of some sort. But I'd like to point out that this is actually somewhat of a minority position. Here I found the Phil Paper survey on professional philosophers, and even to choose between deontology, consequentialism, and virtue ethics, they didn't even take contractualism, divine command theory, natural law, and these kind of things. But there is we are the problem that we are in. We're not quite in the rational sphere, but we are not really a very diverse people here. So um, this seems like a really big problem for provable safe AI in that provable beneficial AI. Sorry, if it turns out that someone has some true values which are in, let's say, divine command theory or something like that, and then the AI that we implement assigns precisely zero probability to that, then that gives some problems in that then it can't update towards that. Is that correct? And that seems like a big problem.
Well, so yes, anything that the AI assigns zero probability to, it's not going to come to believe it. And so I talk about that in the book, and that you need certain types of universal priors. But there's a difference between what it thinks your preferences are and what its own sort of constitutional ethical principles are. And so it's entirely consistent that it's a consequentialist, and you're a deontologist, and you being a deontologist doesn't mean that if any violation of deontology occurs anywhere in the world, you and the entire world are going to explode. It probably just means you're a little bit ticked off. Would you sacrifice your firstborn child to correct that tiny violation of deontological ethics? No. So your belief in deontological ethics is something that you hold. You assign a certain value to it as I think it's a good thing. It would be nice if other people agreed to it. I'll spend some effort trying to get other people to agree to it, but it's not an absolute. And so it just gets folded into what the machine thinks your preferences are, and that's fine. So if the consequence of some choice would be that you might be sort of materially better off but spiritually worse off because you were induced to violate your own deontological ethics, that's all going to be taken into account, and that's not a problem. So, I mean, the reason for doing this in terms of consequentialism, I mean, it's not that there's no other possible position, and this is the essence of the approach. It just seems to me that otherwise you're building machines to achieve outcomes that you don't prefer. And I can't really find a way to do that consistently. It doesn't seem to make sense that I prefer the world to be like this, but I'm going to build machines to make the world be like that, which I don't prefer. So, and I'm not a professional philosopher, but Toby Ord read the book very carefully, and he thinks that and I wouldn't say I have a version of consequentialist preference utilitarianism, but the version that he perceives as being conveyed by the book apparently fixes some bugs that I didn't know existed. So at some point, I think he said he might write something about that. So I don't see this as absolutely a critical stand or fall issue. I think if you were a deontologist, you might change some of the details, but you're still going to have to deal with the fact that the machine doesn't know what people want and is going to have to act accordingly. And reading Mill, right? A lot of Mill's utilitarianism actually is complaining that all of these critics of utilitarianism just don't get it, right? They just don't see that the deontological principles follow from consequentialism. Give me a deontological principle that you believe in, which has bad consequences to the world, but nonetheless you're going to stick to it, right? And so he gets kind of frustrated and angry, thinking, look, why do I have to keep saying this stuff? It's all pretty straightforward, and just think of it this way, this way, this way. And so I kind of share Mill's frustration that in many cases, these are not actually contradictory views. So in particular, when he talks about deontology, it's essentially what we would call a compilation argument, right? You've got the basic principles of consequentialism, but they're really expensive to calculate all the time. So he talks about mariners going to sea. They take an almanac, which already has the results of all the astronomical calculations. They don't, do, pages and pages of math while they're on the ship. They just look up in the book and find out what the answer is. And he says it's the same principle, that you go out in real life with rules of thumb that guide your behavior. And generally, as long as we all follow these rules of thumb, the consequences turn out to be good. And in fact, and then he says, well, that's how you design these rules of thumb in the first place, right? As long as we all follow these rules, the consequences are good. If we all follow these rules and they were designed so that the consequences were bad, that would be kind of daft. So anyway, that's what I have to say.
Okay. Ali has a question. Ali, do you prefer to say the question yourself, or should I read it aloud? It's also on the screen here. Let me see here. Ali has a question. What are your criticisms of the concrete approaches to AI safety pursued by Stuart Armstrong and Paul Christiano, respectively?
I'd have to think more about that. I think so. Stuart has been thinking about value alignment, and he's concerned about some sort of unidentifiability problems, which I don't really think those are serious problems. I mean, it's worth understanding that basic point, but I mean, to me, it doesn't seem plausible to suggest that Garry Kasparov wanted to lose every single game of chess that he ever played, but he's so stupid that he keeps playing winning moves by accident. Is that a plausible explanation for his behavior? No. Well, why not? Well, because we apply the same kinds of inductive principles to the evidence that we do in understanding, in terms of science. And, there are always some kinds of sort of permutation unidentifiabilities. But in this case, I don't think that's a reasonable assumption to sort of flip the sign of both his preferences and his decision-making, because you have to assume that in a case where decisions are completely obvious, then the decision maker will make the completely obvious decision, right? So in the case of chess, if there's a one move checkmate, you expect the system to make that, even if it's a not very good chess player or not very good chess programmer. If it's completely obvious, then that will provide very convincing evidence that in fact the program wants to win or the human wants to win, because they make the completely obvious move. And to assume otherwise, right, to assume that even in completely obvious situations, they choose the action that in fact maximally violates their own preferences, just is not sustainable. And it also it kind of defeats the entire idea that people have preferences at all, right? If there's no circumstance in which you ever act in any way in accordance with your own preferences, then the entire concept of preferences goes away. So that's my little response to some of what Stuart Armstrong has been saying. But generally, I find what Stuart says to be interesting and constructive. And Paul also, I think, Paul has been looking at lots of different stuff. I mean, there's the work on human feedback in terms of training a simulated robot to do various gymnastic things by expressing preferences, saying, no, this one is better than that one, this one's better than that one, this one's better than that one. And that's fine. That all fits within the framework that we're talking about. Some of his other stuff, this kind of sort of recursive self-referential version, I would have to go back and see if I understand all the details, but that's something that I actually talked about maybe 5 years ago, very, very soon after I started working on this, back probably 2014. This idea that you might be able to use a restricted kind of system, so for example, a pure reasoner, to verify the safety of an agent before that agent was released. And so you could have a kind of a bootstrapping process of developing AI systems of greater and greater power, but always be sure that the next one you were planning to create and deploy would be safe. And of course, it rests on some assumptions about the difficulty of this verification problem. But there's quite possibly some interesting results to be found along that line, and I think this is one of the things that Paul's pursuing.
Okay, so I think Johannes is the next in the queue, but before him, I would like to. We have Stuart Armstrong with us today, I believe. He said he would join. So I would like to just ask him if he have any comments or replies to this. I can't see him here, but I don't think I can see more than a limited number of participants. So Stuart, are you there? Nope. Okay, so I can say I discussed this precise point with Stuart previously, and Stuart believes that the research agenda, if you can say, in human compatible, are quite close to what Stuart Armstrong is pursuing, and it's true that Stuart Armstrong doesn't believe that you can, using something like Occam's razor, find a unique decomposition of what the human's policy is and what the ration from the policy go to both split that out into values and rationality, but then you just need to make some normative assumptions, like the principle in the in human compatible, and with these strong normative assumptions, then the problem mostly goes away. So I believe he believes that you are very much on the same page.
Mm-hmm.
At least that's my summary of Stuart Armstrong.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the principle. So Chris Cherniak has a book called Minimal Rationality, which says, okay, well, if you can't be perfectly rational, what are some minimal conditions on any system to even describe it as a sort of quasi-rational agent? And one of them is this principle that in the simplest possible decision-making situations, that you do, in fact, do the right thing, right? And in the simplest possible inference problems, that you make the correct inference. So, and that kind of gives you an anchoring on which you can build the rest.
Okay. So, then Johannes, you had a question?
Yes, coming back to the moral systems, in the chapter 9, you talk about that basically there are certain things that we want the agent not to do, like maximize the utility of a sadist, but I wonder how you would actually specify that in a consequentialist framework, because that sounds like you need some deontology for that. Because like if you actually specify it, like maybe there is actually a small chance that it would be optimal and would be what we want if we knew everything perfectly of the consequences.
Okay, so the issue with sadists, by which we mean, so let's go back a little bit. So the simple model of people is that they have preferences with respect to themselves, and then preferences with respect to others. And this is something that economists talk about. The idea that you can kind of separate your intrinsic well-being, which just simply you can think of as, do I have enough to eat? Do I have a warm place to sleep? Am I physically safe? Am I healthy? These are all self-regarding preferences. And then you could say, well, I also have preferences that other people have a warm place to sleep, that other people have enough to eat, and particularly strong preferences for my children and my other family members and so on, and perhaps less strong for people in other countries. And a sadist would be someone for whom those preferences have a negative weight, right? Which means that they would actually spend their own money, reduce their own intrinsic well-being in order to increase the suffering of others, right? So that's what you would mean by sadist. And Hassani talks about this in the paper that introduces his version of preference utilitarianism. And he basically says that, and he realizes this is a problem for a preference utilitarian, that if your public policy position is we're just going to maximize the sum of utilities for everybody, if someone has extreme negative weight on the well-being of others, if someone is an extreme sadist, you're going to end up allocating some public resources to satisfying those preferences, to the extent that those can be satisfied in a net, as long as there's a net gain, the public policy would end up satisfying that person's sadistic preferences at the expense of other people. And the higher, the more of a sadist that person is, the easier it is for public policy to satisfy them, because you only need a little bit of suffering on the part of other people to give a great deal of happiness to the sadist. So he basically says that if you are that type of person, then you are outside the social contract altogether, right? You don't deserve to have public policy take your preferences into account. And so you just zero out those types of preferences. And that seems to me, at least on the face of it, to be a reasonable solution. And I'll come back to why I think it's a reasonable solution. But there's a second set of preferences, which I also talk about in chapter 9, these relative preferences, where I'm happy, I have, let's say I have a nice umbrella. Well, it's nice to have a nice umbrella because it keeps you dry, and it shakes off easily and it doesn't break, and well, that's great. But maybe I'm happy also because my umbrella is nicer than other people's umbrellas, right? And that type of happiness functions in the same way as sadism, because I get more of that type of happiness if other people's umbrellas are shabby and cheap and so on, relative to mine. And so the question would be, well, should we also zero out these relative preferences? And that's a much more radical proposal. And I don't, so I think this is a research question. We have to sort of start thinking through this. And it's actually much more complicated than that, because it's not just, I'm not just happy because other people have shabbier umbrellas. It has to be that they perceive my umbrella to be better than theirs. And I perceive their perceiving, so I derive some self-satisfaction from that, right? So just hiding my umbrella away and say, oh, I have a nicer umbrella, right? I don't get as much of my social status jollies from that. So it gets quite complicated, and you have to figure out, are there ways to kind of get rid of the negative effects of these relative preferences without actually completely ignoring them in the way the AI system makes decisions on behalf of multiple people. So this is something that I don't yet understand well enough to answer. So is this a deontological, so coming back to the question, why is zeroing out the preferences of the sadist a good idea? And I think one could look at this in the following way, right? So suppose that the AI system is acting not on behalf of humans, but on behalf of a randomly generated collection of other AI systems that have sort of randomly generated preferences, some of which are positive towards other agents and some of which are negative towards other agents. And sadism is just as prevalent and just as has just as large weighting factors as altruism. That wouldn't, if those were the only entities that existed, the entire notion of being beneficial would kind of go away anyway, right? So I think that in order for us to be doing this whole thing in the first place, it has to be that the notion that most people should be altruistic is kind of built in to the entire enterprise. So that's why I think zero, sort of saying, okay, we're going to exclude these sadistic preferences is a reasonable one. So I don't know that it's necessarily some arbitrary deontological principle. If you want to call it that, fine. But I think it's sort of it's a prerequisite for even engaging in this idea that we're going to build beneficial AI in the first place.
The thing that you're saying is basically positive experiences are good. That is the most fundamental thing that you need to start an argument at all.
I'm sorry, I didn't quite catch that.
So the thing that we need to have a meaningful discussion at all is to at least declare basically that the experiences of conscious beings are what we care about, and we want them to be positive.
Yep.
Okay.
That's a reasonable point.
Okay. So the next question is from Alexei Turchin, who asked the question, when do you expect we will have human-level machine intelligence and superintelligence AI? And I pointed out that this is something you refused to answer in the book. You didn't want to give the 10, 50%, and 90% confidence levels. But I agree that this is a really important question. And one of the big thing that makes people wary about, and that you say, is that there is an obvious risk of being misquoted. And if you add some qualifiers, then most likely people will just ignore every qualifier you say, and then if you say 2069, it will end up in some of these graphs here, and you don't want that. So, and that's of course fair enough. So we came up with something with a statement that what you say here shouldn't be quoted externally, and uh, if you are quoted externally, then that should be a misquote. Under these quoting rules, would you be willing to give some estimates, roughly how is your probability distribution on human level machine intelligence and superintelligence?
Well, so I mean, in the book, I explain this story. I was operating under such a set of rules, Chatham House rules. And then the newspaper just went ahead and ignored the Chatham House rule and published my name and sort of a extremely distorted quotation. So I don't hold much faith in the fact that these rules are going to be respected. So I think I said in the book that, what I said was, I think it's quite likely within the lifetime of my children. So you can, and I said that, of course, thanks to advances in medical care, possibly produced by AI, my children might live a lot longer than we do. So it's a fairly elastic prediction. But some people argue, for example, so Oren Etzioni effectively took the same data. In fact, so he didn't like the answer that he was getting, or that Bostrom was getting, that people think that AGI is going to happen and mostly sometime around the middle of the century. So he didn't like that answer. So he ran his own survey. And then he declared that anyone who put a number which was more than 25 years in the future was effectively saying it was never going to happen. And therefore, there was absolutely nothing to worry about. And I pointed out that included Nick Bostrom. And so Oren was claiming that, in fact, the experts are not at all concerned about the risk of AI. And his evidence was that Nick Bostrom is not at all concerned about the risk of AI, and Stuart Russell is not at all concerned, and Bill Gates is not at all concerned, because all those people think that it'll probably take more than 25 years. We're not at all concerned about the risk of AI. So I think that a lot of people think it's going to take more than 25 years, myself included. I base that on just how many more difficult things there are that we have to figure out, and sort of how quickly we have figured out difficult stuff in the past. It's I certainly don't believe that we basically have the answer and we just need bigger machines and more data, and then we'll get there. And I don't really understand. I mean, I know there are people who say that. So Ilya Sutskever, for example, last year that said we had 5 years. And I just don't understand, because the qualitative behaviors of the machines are not really changing. I mean, to give an example, right? So you look at these language models, and people say, "Oh my goodness, look at GPT-2. It's sort of, it's like 90% of an intelligent human being, because it produces text that, 90% of it kind of looks like sentences that an intelligent human being would say." But if parrots had a little bit more short-term memory, they would generate sentences that sound like what intelligent human beings say. And chatbots do it all the time. And they're certainly nowhere close. They're not 90% of an intelligent human being. They're 0% of an intelligent human being. So the ability to generate plausible looking text has nothing to do with intelligence. And it's a little bit like the Ptolemaic astronomical system, right? So Ptolemy, and his followers and others, developed an actually pretty accurate predictive system for saying, where are the planets going to appear at any given date. And it had cycles and epicycles on the epicycles and so on. But it had nothing to do with what was actually going on, right? It was an entirely superficial description of the solar system. And that's basically what we're currently doing with systems like GPT-2. So I think we've got big qualitative gaps, and those big qualitative gaps take time to fill, and they're hard to predict. So, but I on the other hand, there's a lot of smart people working on it. Most of the smart people realize that these gaps exist, and they are trying hard to fill them. And I don't see any reason to think that they're not going to be filled. So the issue is, how sure are we that we will have solved the control problem and also sort of disseminated the solution to the control problem in time to avoid potential negative consequences.
Okay. Then we have a question from Tassilo. Tassilo, would you like to state your question first? I don't know if Tassilo is here.
Yeah. Hello.
Hi.
So I was thinking about misinformation and because current systems can't identify misinformation, and I was thinking about how does an AI, what would an intelligent altruistic AI do to trust information that its creator gives it?
Mm-hmm. So when you say the creator, you mean the AI researcher who designed the system in the first place, or the owner of the system?
Yeah, because in the book you talk about that you would have to design the system that it's useful to the person who owns it or that has it, but the system should also be optimized to help others. And if I say to the AI to get me coffee, I think the AI would have to do a lot of research first to look up if other people are in conflict with me getting coffee.
Well, so it would have to, yeah, and it should consider, what are the possible negative effects on others. And it's easy for us to say, well, coffee, getting coffee, because it's something we do all the time, everyone does it all the time, it can't be that bad. But replace coffee by a cigarette, or and then you've got secondhand smoke, or some opioids or whatever. So you have to do some counterfactuals, and certainly you don't want to just say, well, anything I ask you to do must be okay, so I'm just going to do it regardless of, without checking for negative consequences for anybody else. But so But I think that's not quite, that's not quite the misinformation issue. I think the misinformation issue is a significant one, but in probabilistic reasoning systems, it's almost a kind of a, it's a uh, rule one of best practices in building probabilistic AI systems is to separate the evidence variables from the truth variables. So, for example, if you're if you're getting data from a device that measures the temperature of a patient in the intensive care unit, you have one variable for what's the temperature of the patient, and you have another variable for what is the system reporting the temperature to be, right? Because the measurement process can always introduce error, and sometimes it's completely wrong, right? If the thermometer
Sorry, I think Stuart, I'm not hearing you.
Seems to have vanished.
Oh no. So yeah, there might be some technical problems. I can't see him in the chat either. So okay, so I can use the break to just give a few practical information. Next week we will be reading. Let me just see if I can find the text. So I might have will be saying that. Hold on. The role of cooperation in responsible AI development, and that will be on Wednesday in precisely 1 week. And I can see the time is almost up. Stuart Russell needed to leave in 5 minutes anyway. So this might be it. If he comes back, then I expect there's only time for one extra question, and there are 4 questions as far as I can see. There is my question on quantum computing, there's Chris' question, Dragan's question, and Matthias' question. If he manages to reconnect, who should we, and Ali also had a question, so there are 5 questions. What should we pose to him if if he comes back? Chris, Ali is voting for you, Chris. Chris, which of your 4 questions would you ask him?
Hold on, right, I just switch to that. So what have I got? I would like to ask him, I think, I'd like to ask the one about his principles being adopted by official bodies.
Okay, we'll ask that to him if he returns. In the meantime, let me see if maybe he is has sent me an email or something. Because no, nothing. So yeah. Yeah. So that's
Well, he's in the chat.
no, that's Stuart Armstrong, a different Stuart, unfortunately. Or fortunately, I shouldn't say unfortunately. Hello, Stuart.
Hello.
So we're missing the other Stuart.
We are missing the other Stuart. He went out of the chat. Maybe his computer crashed. So he has been here and have answered our questions for 55 minutes, and now he is gone. So
Okay,
yeah.
I'm back.
He's back. Great.
Yeah. I think my power ran out. Okay. So I think I was just talking about measuring temperature in the intensive care unit, right? So it's perfectly natural that you write your probability models to allow for the possibility that the thermometer becomes detached and just reports room temperature, just as you can, if you were reading tweets from a particular tweeter who is known to lie almost all the time, then those tweets are just what they say, right? There is a sequence of characters on the screen. That's the evidence. What it tells you about the actual world is a separate matter, and to turn it into a belief about the world, you have to kind of reverse engineer it, and that's where your model of how trustworthy someone is, or whether their tweets have been hacked by some other entity, et cetera, all of these things have to be taken into account as they are by people when they're absorbing information on the web. And I think actually AI systems can be a lot less gullible than humans, because I think we haven't yet adjusted to the volume of false information that the world is currently generating. There are some difficult issues with respect to preferences, because people have an incentive not to be honest about their preferences if you don't set up the protocol in the right way, and also not to be honest about their abilities. So they would pretend to be more helpless than they really are in order to get more resources from the machine. So these are things that game theorists, economists, mathematical economists love to think about. And there are, in fact, a bunch of papers talking about how you design the mechanism so that people have an incentive to be honest in describing their own preferences. But this is hardly a new problem.
Okay. So I think the time is just about up. So I would like to first, of course, apologize to all the people who have submitted questions that we didn't have time to. Finally, I would like to say thank you to Stuart Russell for joining us, and to the rest of the reading group. I hope to see you next week.